The Atheist Debates Patreon project presents Bad Debate Topics. So I don't do nearly as many debates as I'd like to. Ideally, I'd love to do one or two a month, maybe more. It's just not that easy to find a debate opponent, come up with a topic, come up with a format, find a venue. And that's why I'm doing a lot of other things as well as debating and continuing to do the Atheist Experience TV show. But I work with a number of different organizations. One of my favorites, I've done a number of debates there, is the Bible and Beer Consortium. Ezra Boggs contacted me recently to ask me if I was interested in doing a debate, and named my opponent, and I was like, yes, of course. Let's see if we can figure this out. There'll also be, hopefully in the near future, a discussion with Ezra about Bible and Beer Consortium, about the process of debates, and it'll be a sort of a head-to-head between the two of us, but also showing why we can get along, why we value these sorts of discussions. So I'm happy anytime anybody wants to, put together a debate, but it's not easy. And there are far more requests than there will ever be debates. One of the things that happens from time to time is we can't agree on a topic for the debate. Now, I'm far more flexible than some of my friends are. I'll talk a little bit about topics that I have friends who just won't debate those topics. But today I thought I'd do something just based on this debate that's coming up in July. I was offered a choice of 3 topics. Now, I'm not stuck with any of the 3. I can turn them all down if I want to. I can say, well, let me propose a 4th, or let me alter this one. When I did the debate review of I think my last debate with Matt Slick, I believe I went through some of the proposed debate topics for that to show how bad they were. If I didn't do that in a video, somebody let me know and I will go through that. I know I put a Facebook post up talking about the debate topics and how bad some of them were. It's like not quite have you stopped beating your spouse type questions, but there were a lot of false dichotomies. So the 3 topics that I was presented for this debate, I'm going to go ahead and read them out, and you can pause if you want to and think about it and see if you can decide which one, if any, I accepted and which I rejected and why. And then we'll go through and talk about that. And I know that there's going to be people who are saying, hey, Matt, come on now. I'm not going to be doing public debates. I don't need to pick topics. I'm here to get information about how to address these topics. Stay tuned. Because the truth is, every time you're having a conversation, there's a topic and it may change. And hopefully you'll get some stuff out of this about how and why I chose which topics I was going to do. So the 3 proposed topics were, number 1, can faith be rational? Number 2, does atheism have the epistemological resource to sustain science? And number 3, is strong naturalism the best position? I would play some music here, but you guys can pause and we'll just move on to figuring out which ones I accepted and which ones I rejected. Well, for most of you, it won't come as any surprise that I accepted the first topic. Can faith be rational? Now, I'm not going to go into great detail about the strategy for that actual debate, but I am going to talk about that topic briefly before I get to the 2 I rejected and why. I have a friend who I respect greatly who's done far more debates than I have. He's a bit of a mentor, and I know that he has said on a number of occasions that he would not debate the subject, is faith rational, or is theism rational, or is Christianity rational? And this is because for people who run in philosophy circles, there is a particular usage of the word rational, by which, as long as something is internally consistent, it's rational. And so there's a worry that, is Christianity rational or is theism rational? And somebody gets up and presents a model of theism that is internally consistent, then all of a sudden they get to declare a win. This my model is, I'm going to call it theism, and it's internally consistent, therefore it's rational, and I win the debate. A lot of the objection to this comes from academic circles and thinking about debates in terms of winning or losing, or worse yet, points scored to collegiate team debates. That's not what I do. Debate's just the best word that we have for what I'd like to do, which is have a conversation about a subject. And so if somebody could put together a version of faith or theism that is viewed as rational on a technicality because it's internally consistent, I don't care. It doesn't matter. Hey, Harry Potter may be internally consistent. When we're asking whether or not something's rational, we're asking whether or not there's good reason to believe it. Now, the subject that I went with is faith rational, which we'll deal with in July of 2018. There's a lot of different ways to address it. Between now and July, I'll work up exactly what I want to say about it and how to address it. I'm not going to do it here. But it's a subject that could actually be improved by altering the wording a little bit, and maybe could be improved by defining our terms a little bit before we get to the debate. Right now, I'm considering whether or not I want to do that. If the subject of the debate is not the most critical thing to me, certainly there are bad ones. There are ones that I will avoid because there's no good way to get to something productive. But I think with a subject like is faith rational, we're generally talking about, hey, do we have good reason to think that, this particular doctrine is true, or this method, if you want to view faith as a method for determining the truth. Is it rational to make decisions based on faith? And we'll probably address it from a number of different angles when the debate comes up, but I am at least optimistic that there will be a good discussion there that will draw some people in and give people my thoughts and my opponent's thoughts. But there were two topics that I rejected. So let's take a look at them, why I rejected them, and how this is relevant to non-debates. You've got to pick out your topics. What the hell does that have to do with me? So the second proposed topic, which I'm going to read just to make sure I got it right, does atheism have the epistemological resource to sustain science? First reason that I rejected that topic, it's too long, too wordy. It is not the sort of thing that's going to draw people into a debate. And it reads as if it's a trap. Now, I'm not the slightest bit worried about being trapped because I'm not going to defend a position that I don't hold. This topic could be salvaged if we reworded it a little bit. The interesting things to note here is the question is, does atheism have the epistemological resource to sustain science? Now, atheism in the weak sense, atheism in the soft atheism sense of I do not believe or I am not convinced that there is a God, which is a better way of putting it, well, that doesn't suggest that it can serve as an epistemological, as a foundation for science. What this question is really asking, and you have to, you can dig through some of the philosophical texts to find out the specific way people are using this. But it is essentially, if in fact we live in a world with no God, do we have any good grounding upon which we can trust science? That's really what it's asking. And the hope here is that if you can show that science can't be trustworthy in a world without a God, that all of a sudden your belief in a God becomes justified. Well, that's not true. If it turns out that in a world without a God, we can't have a justification for science, for relying science or thinking that our epistemological foundations of science are sound, then it may just be the case that our foundations for science aren't sound. This is something you'll see over and over again, where instead of offering argument and evidence for the position they hold, hey, there's a God, they will instead try to argue against some other position, as if disproving that makes their God proposition win by default. You see it a lot in creationism versus evolution. It's not like they're going out and doing research and presenting evidence for creationism or a creator. Instead, they're trying to poke holes in evolutionary models. And they can poke as many holes as they want, because even if we find out that everything we know and understand about biology and evolution is wrong, that doesn't mean that their proposed explanation is correct. So The idea behind this, as I noted, is that, oh, if a world without a God can't come up with a foundation where science can reasonably be trusted, then we have to have a God. And that's just not true. It just may be that science isn't trustworthy. And we're back to the sort of wishful thinking of, I want to live in a world where reason is reasonable. I want to live in a world where science can be trusted. What's really bad about this topic is that if we worded it so that it's a little bit more fair, I think that it would be pretty trivial to point out that only in a universe where we take no consideration of a God can we reliably trust the findings of science. So science isn't based on philosophical naturalism, or what some will call strong naturalism. It's based on methodological naturalism. It doesn't say the supernatural doesn't exist. It says we don't get to consider the supernatural when we're doing science, because we don't have any access to verify supernatural causation or supernatural existence or know what's going on. And so I know that not all science is beakers and stuff like that, but just bear with me for a moment. If I mix two chemicals together in the lab and my foundations of science don't allow me to consider supernatural causation and interference, all of a sudden I have consistent, reliable results. This is a factor that I just don't have to consider. Now, all the findings in science, right from the foundations of methodological naturalism, are all tentative and they're subject to revision. And so we have the single most consistently reliable method for discovering the truth about reality. The scientific methods, the process of inquiry, critical thinking, skepticism, all this comes together, but it is reliable because we begin with a presumption of consistency and we don't get to consider supernatural causation. So only in a world where we don't consider the supernatural can we ever view the results of science as reasonable and reliable. Because if you have the supernatural, if God can change the results of your scientific experiment, if you can pour these two chemicals together and sometimes it turns red and sometimes it turns blue, and the difference between those two is a God is manipulating it, or an angel or a demon or some other supernatural thing that we have no way of accessing and understanding or evaluating or confirming that it did anything, now we can't do science. Because if you get two different results, you don't just get to look at the natural factors and say, the temperature was higher here, the humidity was higher here. You don't just get to do that, because even if you show that this is consistent with result A at this temperature and consistent with result B at a different temperature, that doesn't mean that the supernatural beings and entities couldn't intervene and change that or modify it. So in a universe where there is a supernatural being who could potentially intervene, science becomes unreliable. That debate topic, which I think is an interesting topic, let's get to the foundations of reason, let's get to the foundations of science, but it's worded in such a way, does atheism have the epistemological resource to sustain science? It's not just worded sloppily about the foundations of science, but to sustain science. Like, how can you keep doing science when there's no God? I don't know how you can do science when you believe in a God, because no matter how consistent you get of a result you get, always in the back of your mind you have to go, well, maybe if I'd have prayed harder, I would have got a different result. Maybe if God had wanted this to turn out a little bit different, it would have. So you don't get to a very high confidence level. Now, I'm not somebody who advocates for absolute certainty at all. I'm not convinced that you can be absolutely certain about anything. But I've talked before about maximal certainty or maximal confidence, where things that are derived from the foundations of reason, identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, directly leads to mathematics. Mathematics serves as a cornerstone for physics, and then you get to hard sciences, and then you get to softer sciences, and it's about inference and induction. Science is never making a claim that they have discovered this is the absolute truth. Instead, we have a new tentative position based on the evidence, It's not based on a presumption that the supernatural doesn't exist. It is based on the recognition that we cannot evaluate the supernatural in with our results. So we will, for the sake of argument, pretend that it doesn't exist and evaluate it without those factors. It's kind of like saying, hey, I went out to mow my grass the other day and I pulled the starter on the mower and it started up. So therefore, I got a reliable working lawnmower. Oh, wait a minute. I didn't think about the fact that the mower might actually not be working, but God miraculously allowed it to work so I could get that one mow in. Oh my gosh, now I can't say anything about whether or not I have a working lawnmower because maybe it only works because of God. Maybe the lawnmower itself doesn't work. Maybe I've been given a strong delusion that the lawnmower worked by a God intervening. So all that falls apart when you start adding a God in there. The topic was too long and really confused. And the reason that it felt like a trip or a trap is because what they're trying to do here is not present evidence for what they believe, but knock down what somebody else believes. And so if they can put the atheists or the secularists on the defense, now all of a sudden they don't have to do any actual work. They can give the impression that they have defended their position without ever actually defending it. This happens all the time. So the third topic that I rejected was, is strong naturalism the best position? Think about that for a second. As far as I can tell, that's just a bad topic. First of all, I don't advocate for a position of strong naturalism or philosophical naturalism. As I was mentioning before when we talked about science, I advocate for methodological naturalism. I'm not saying the supernatural does not exist. I'm saying we don't get to consider it. Now, there is a way to argue that the supernatural does not exist. I've talked before about the null hypothesis and default positions, and I think it's reasonable to say that my tentative position is that the supernatural doesn't exist until such time as somebody demonstrates that it does. But the question is really strange in the way it's worded. Is strong naturalism the best position? Well, best in what respect? It implies that we're only talking about naturalism versus supernaturalism. In which case, if there's two, then wouldn't you just argue about which one is better? But I don't care so as much about which one's better as I do about which one's more likely to be correct. Maybe that's what the question means. Is strong naturalism more likely to be correct than what? Than all the other ones? Does that mean that in defense of strong naturalism, I have to talk about all other possible models where there's, mixes or not? Or do I just have to make the case for why strong naturalism is what? All we can do? As somebody who's advocating for methodological naturalism, it doesn't make sense to put me in a position where I have to defend something that isn't mine. That would be like me saying, I'm going to debate this theist, and he is a Catholic, and I've decided that I want to have him defend the proposition that Jehovah's Witnesses are the best Christians. I don't even know if he holds that position. The reason this doesn't come up, this obvious flaw here in thinking isn't recognizable to most apologists, is because, if you're an atheist, then you have to be a strong naturalist. And in some connotations, I am, as I was noting, that you can say this is my tentative position until such time as there's other evidence. But they still have in their mind that, yes, it's true, either there is a God or there isn't. But they're viewing atheists as convinced that there is no God, which means I'm convinced that there's a world where there's nothing supernatural. First of all, it's not necessarily the case. As a skeptic, as a secularist and a critical thinker, I do not believe that there's anything supernatural. I'm not convinced of that. That said, there are atheists, as much as people might not want to talk about it, who have all sorts of superstitious and supernatural beliefs. Oh, they're not, they don't think there's a God or any of this, but maybe they believe there's, some kind of karma or a hive mind, universal mind, we're all connected, etc. So it's a bit presumptuous to, as a theist, and in particular a Christian theist, to come to a debate where you've suggested that your opponent defend a position that you don't know whether or not he holds, and which doesn't do anything to bolster your beliefs. And that's a little disturbing, because I don't do debates for points. I don't do them for score. I'm happy if people want to poll the audience before or after to see if anybody's minds change, but most people don't change their mind over the course of a 1, 2, 3 hour debate. It may just be that you've given information that they evaluate later. And we know that these sorts of conversations do change people's mind. But we also know that the best way to, or I think we can argue that the best way to have these sorts of conversations is to make sure that we're engaging with each other openly and honestly, and that we are defending the positions that we actually hold. This is incredibly frustrating for apologists. And this is where we get to the point of why bad debate topics matter to people who aren't going to be in a formal public debate. So first of all, you, in conversations, are always talking about some debate topic. It may not be spelled out, it may not be clear, but you can watch for people trying to saddle you to defend positions that you either don't hold, or if they're indefensible, if they turn out to not be true, it doesn't tell you anything about whether or not your opponent, your interlocutor's position is correct. If you can poke all kinds of holes in evolution, it doesn't tell you whether or not creationism is correct. You can point out that atheism doesn't serve as a foundation for science, but nobody was saying it does. The foundations of science are based on reason. And so if you wanted to, this could, the debate topic could just be another thing like tag, or the transcendental argument for the existence of God, where you basically say you can't trust anything. You can't have any reason to think that anything's true unless there's a God to make it true or vouch for it, vouchsafe, be the foundation. When really what we're doing is talking about a world that we live in and what is most reasonable based on the current set of information. And that's going to change. And you don't get to criticize science for changing what its best model is, when what it's doing is saying, we now have more information, we will revise and expand or correct and change our views. For countless years now, we've had discussions about whether or not there's a God, whether or not there's something supernatural. And there's no new evidence, and there's no Nobel Prize for discovering God. Even the Templeton Foundation, which is desperate to find ways to demonstrate that there's a God and something reliable, has consistently failed to do so. There's a reason why we keep having these debates. If in fact there was a God who had made its presence, existence known to everybody, the debates would be over. Instead, the debates would be more about, okay, given that we now know that there's a God, should we worship him? Should we be one of his followers? Should we respect or revere him? Does his moral view actually matter to us? Those are the kind of debates that you might be having if there was good reason to think there's a God. And for countless years, it's been, let's come up with a new way to try to demonstrate what we already believe. It's this beginning with a conclusion, there is a God. Now let me construct an argument that leads to that. And then somebody finds a flaw in it. So let me reform the argument, and somebody finds a flaw in that, and let me reform that argument. And this repeats over and over and over again. And it doesn't seem that they're able to recognize that the problem is they are trying to lead the evidence where they want it to go, rather than following the evidence where it leads. And so as a matter of tactic or strategy, instead of defending the gospel that they are sworn to defend, instead of fulfilling their obligation under 1 Peter 3:15, if we're talking about Christians, instead they want to prop up a straw model of the universe without a God and try to poke holes in it. Of, if there is no God, then I don't see how you could possibly have a foundation for morality. So we have that discussion. And we show that you can actually have a foundation. Well, I don't see how you can trust science. Well, we can show, as I talked about earlier, that actually in a universe where they have to consider supernatural things, science becomes wholly untrustworthy. Not only are we talking about unfalsifiable and untestable propositions when we're working in the realm of the supernatural, what can you ever be reasonably confident about when there could be someone intervening? I don't know. I also don't know, well, I think I do. I was going to say that I don't know why they're taking this particular proposed topic instead of defending their own. And that's why I chose the first topic, can faith be rational? I think I know what sorts of arguments he might be able to make. I think that I have a good understanding of how, or at least I hope to by July, to communicate the real question behind can faith be rational, what we should care about, what we shouldn't care about. And that's why I chose that topic. And I didn't suggest any rewording of it, or I haven't yet. I may talk a little bit about what definitions we're going to use just so that we don't have to spend as much time in our opening statements defining a bunch of terms. So there's the reasons, or some of the reasons, why I rejected those debate topics. When it comes to the conversations that you're having with people, be on the lookout for topics that put you on defense when you haven't necessarily adopted a position. I've talked before about Jesus mythicism. I don't assert that there was no Jesus. There may have been, there may not have been. It really doesn't matter that much to me. What matters is the theists, the Christian theists, cannot demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that the individual existed and was divine, etc., to make up all the things that are part of their doctrine. It's really similar to other things that I've discussed. Strategically, I don't go into a debate suggesting topics that are designed to trip up or play games or straw man the opponent. As a matter of fact, a good chunk of the debates that I've done, the topics have been suggested by the opponent or the organizer. And some of them were great topics that were fun and interesting to discuss. Next month, I'm hoping to do a review of the debate I did with Abdu Murray on whether or not America should be one nation under God. It gets into issues of rights, and I know there's a little bit of morality in there as well. But it was far more interesting to have that discussion than just another, do we have good reason to believe that God exists? We're going to go through the Kalam cosmological argument. We're going to go through a teleological argument. We're going to go through a moral argument. I think that you're going to see more of that. I'm pretty sure that I will be debating, does God exist in some form or another, until I drop dead. But I needed folks to be aware that the process by which we arrange a debate is complicated. What kind of format are we going to have? How much time? Is it going to be just a joint press conference where I talk, you talk, I talk, you talk? Or are we actually going to interact? And the interactions are the part that I like best, along with audience Q&A, because now you have more minds to think of all the things that neither of you thought. So that's it for how I went about determining which of these debate topics I wanted to address. I look forward to the debate in July. And I know that probably one of the first questions I'm going to get is, okay, so you've said this, you're going to have this debate in July, and it's Bible and Beer Consortium and blah, 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 but you didn't say who you were debating. At least I don't think I did. It's Dr. John Mark Reynolds, who I'm not very familiar with, but his name has come up many times with people saying, oh, you should debate this guy. And by and large, I'm happy to debate almost anybody. I mean, especially if they're, considered thoughtful, if they are open to a conversation. I don't care what their credentials are. I don't care how big their church is. It's all about, can we have a good conversation? And picking a debate topic is probably the first step towards being able to have a good conversation. So we look forward to that debate in July. I'll have more videos coming up for you soon. Thanks to everybody who's supporting, and there'll be a link at the end on how you can support videos from this Patreon project, focusing on debates. Think about the topic, even if you're not in a public formal debate. If you're having an argument, a conversation with somebody, double check from time to time, what subject are you addressing? Has it changed since you started the discussion? And is there a way to point out what has or hasn't changed and make the conversation productive? Try to have an audience whenever you can. I'm not opposed to one-on-one discussions. I don't have the time for them anymore. But if it's possible and you're comfortable, it's always good to have some audience, even one or two. If you're sitting around at dinner and you're having a discussion with somebody and there's other people at the table, the other thing to be considerate of is, do those other people want this conversation going on now? Because if you are constantly pushing a conversation that pretty much nobody but you wants, it doesn't matter how good your arguments are, how good your evidence is, you just look like kind of obnoxious, and you can turn people off. Because the debates and discussions aren't always about who has the best argument and the best evidence. There are aspects of theater, there are components of personality conflicts, and the topic that you're talking about can really be a waste of time if the definitions aren't clear, if it's not fairly addressing one position versus another. And that is something that we should all consider, whether we're getting ready for a debate or going home for the holidays to argue politics with our relatives.
This video is made possible by supporters of the Atheist Debates Patreon project. You can find more information and add your support at patreon.com/atheistdebates.